Namaste, everyone. I hope you're doing well. Welcome to another episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast. Prime Minister Modi has been in power for about a year now. He was re elected in a historic mandate in May of 2019. And there have been plenty of fundamental changes in governance and politics ever since. In today's episode, we look at PM Modi's second tenure and its impact on the politics and other aspects of our country. So, joining me on this very special episode of the Bharatvaarta podcast, I have Rangesh Sridhar, who is back after his blockbuster debut on the communism episode. Today, he'll be speaking more specifically about BJP's own evolution under PM Modi. Hi, Rangesh. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thanks for having me again.
Pleasure to have you back. Rohit Jayaraman also returns after a long hiatus. You've heard him before speak about social and political issues. He'll be addressing some of the key decisions that have happened over the last year. Hey, Rohit, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me back, Gary.
Finally, we have Ashish Chandorkar, who attended PM Modi's swearing-in ceremony about a year ago and has followed him very closely for many years. We've spoken about his love for Poha earlier, but his love for public policy is no less. Welcome, Ashish.
Thank you, Gary. It's a day of Poha plus public policy. Had
Awesome.
Poha.
Awesome. So, all right, guys, just a quick question around the table to begin this podcast. If you were to score Modi 2.0 on the following lines: political, social, and economic impact on, let's say, a 10-point scale, what would you give him? So, we'll start with you, Rangesh.
Political about, specifically talking about the past 1 year, political about 7, social about 8, and economic about 5.
Okay. It kind of sets the tone for the rest of the episode, I suppose. Rohit, what about you?
I think I'll be a bit more liberal than Rangesh. So I think political, I will give 8. Just like social and economic, I'll probably give 6 to 7.
Okay. And finally, Ashish?
I agree with what Rohit said. I think that's probably my assessment as well.
Okay. So this kind of sets the tone. Rohit, we'll start with you. Now, Modi's core base of voters who align with him on his perceived Hindutva appeal are often disappointed that he hasn't done more, right? But if you look at the last year or so with Article 370 or CAA or even Ram Janmabhoomi, these are all massive wins. So how would you say his ideological bent and method has changed in the second term?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Carrie. And the fact that a lot of people are actually disappointed with the performance of the Prime Minister on these issues is something that's very interesting and tells a lot about where India has moved, right, over the last, say, 10, 15 years. Or I would say especially 10 years. And what I would want to say here to start off is if you look at why the Jan Sangh, and I mean, as the predecessor of the BJP was formed, two of the biggest issues that really were a catalyst to the formation of the party in itself, especially for Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee, were of course the condition of Hindus in East Pakistan, and also the whole issue of Article 370 and the full integration of Jammu and Kashmir with India. And today, if you look at it, these are two things that were literally key issues for the founder of this party, were both fulfilled by this government, right, within 6 months of it getting re-elected. And then when you look at a lot of people saying that issues like, the Hindutva agenda hasn't been moving or been fulfilled, I think it just says that the expectations of what a Hindutva agenda means or can achieve in the context of India have really been radically changed over the last many years, and it's obviously started with I think a lot more people getting into social media, understanding some of these issues in greater detail, and generally, obviously, I think this is a clear question of PM Modi to some extent being a victim of his own success in the fact that him winning twice with a majority, again, not something a lot of people would have predicted even in 2013 or 14. And then being able to push a lot of these things through, it has just whetted the appetite of some of the core Hindutva supporters for more. Therefore, I think it's more this thing of PM Modi that people just expect a lot from his government, both in terms of their ideological commitment and more, I think, in terms of what is possible from a Hindutva perspective in India today. I don't know how much of that is fair in the sense that is this expectation fair, but I think this is the mindset that is going on, at least subconsciously.
Yeah, I mean, somewhere people kind of expect that, the 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 mandate that they've got, right, the significant mandate is sort of, I mean, people kind of expect that it's going to be a short-lived phenomena, and they want to sort of pack everything possible in as little time as possible. But moving these things within sort of a really complex machinery such as the Indian government or bureaucracy is not a trivial thing, right? Ashish, you would agree with that?
Yes, Carrie. So, see, those of us who have followed politics, I think we'll all agree that when we talk about quote unquote core agenda, see, BJP only had three core agendas. One was Ram Mandir, which started, the political movement started in 1989, while, of course, the VHP had been talking about it for a while. Then there was the Uniform Civil Code, and then there was Article 370. Article 370, by the way, was actually the founding principle of the old Jansangh in a way, where Pandit Shyama Prasad Mukherjee actually laid his life for that cause effectively, right, many years ago. So now, if you really look at it, the two of those three things have been already achieved, right, in this term itself, in the first year of the second term. There is this law which is called Amara's law, which is used in technology, which is to say that we tend to overestimate the effect of technology in the short run and underestimate the effect in the long run. I think that's how people look at political impact also. What's happening in front of you, people don't think it's important enough. I mean, imagine the party was created on three principles and two of them have been achieved. In a way, it's actually a chance for BJP to reinvent itself. And create or add more to its core agenda in that sense. But the lot of political commentary and analysis is very dismissive of the impact of what's happening in front of you, while you tend to glorify things which has happened in the past, saying these were big things. So I think that is a dichotomy here. The fact is that, like you rightly said, Carrie, people want to pack a lot of things in 5 years, or let's say 10 years of 2 terms. While I suppose the view of the PM or the party is that they are looking at it at a much longer canvas, let's say, multiple terms. And hence they are spacing out in what their mind is the core agenda, which kind of doesn't, the timing of that doesn't match with what the supporters want on social media.
Yeah, and Rangesh, to what extent do you feel that some of this agenda, right, the core agenda, as Ashish termed it, reflects the views of the people on the ground versus, people, let's say, a microcosm of the public that is on Twitter or Facebook or social media?
Before I answer that question, Carrie, I just thought I should, initiate a debate, or rather, add to this discussion the fact, uh, the philosophy that has driven the Narendra Modi-led BJP, not just the government but the party as well, ever since they took power in 2014, and how that is largely driven and linked to the lessons that they've learned from NDA one's defeat in the 2004 elections under Shri Atal Bihari Vajpayee. The NDA one government had picked up and run with a lot of items which were close to the heart of so quote unquote the core constituency, right? Be it saffronization of textbooks or correction of textbooks rather in the view of the core supporters, or be it a disinvestment, which is the economic agenda of the core supporters. They did a lot on that front, right? But one of the biggest lessons in hindsight, of course, talking from the vantage point of the hindsight, is that they ignored political consolidation and they did nothing to correct the belief. Despite Antyodaya, they did nothing to correct the belief that theirs wasn't, was not a pro-poor government, and they did not focus on politics throughout the 6 years of NDA one. And I calculate, from the 98 administration itself, from 98 to 2004, they lost a string of major elections. The party got eviscerated in UP. They became junior partners in Bihar and Odisha around this time, and uh, simply withered away in large parts of the south where they had built up some kind of traction on the back of the Ram Mandir movement. So 2004, in hindsight, was just waiting to happen. And based on these lessons, I think the Prime Minister Modi did 3-4 things right. One is to put political consolidation as the topmost priority in NDA 2, right? That is the Modi 1, Modi 1.0 between 2014 and 2019. Put political consolidation over any other agenda, right? Or over governance or for that matter. Two, put quoting the poor over, let's say, explicit economic reforms targeted at either the middle class or the the moneyed business class. Coming to point one, right? The fact that Modi considered this to be the point that Modi considered political consolidation as the most important agenda in his first term is signaled by the fact that he put his best man, Amit Shah, as in charge of the party and not didn't incorporate him inside government. Right? People say that Amit Shah has always been an organizational man. He's seldom had administrative experience, and that's simply not true because despite being a minister of state in the Gujarat government, he did a lot. Despite being a minister of state in the Gujarat government, he did handle a dozen or close to a dozen ministries and was Modi's Man Friday in administration. In fact, his skills in party and in organization weren't really well established until UP 2013 when he was made the general secretary of the party in Uttar Pradesh and then as the party president. So the fact that he was appointed as the president signaled in hindsight that Modi prioritized political consolidation over any other thing in administration one. And this is seen in the results. BJP formed governments in places where they never have been a major player, Haryana, Maharashtra, Jharkhand, and they grew in places where they simply did not exist. Bengal, Odisha, right? This is the first lever that one must understand which drove administration one, that is 2014 and 19. The second lever is that through his schemes like Jandhan, sanitization for all, and schemes like that, the LPG schemes, he created real physical assets, which, if nothing else, established in the hearts of the poor that Modi cares for them and that Modi is a Garibon ka prime minister. These two things allayed a lot of unnecessary political and I would say unjustified political baggage that Vajpayee's government carried in 2004 until 2004, which resulted in those election results. And this sets the stage for the 2019 win. But once they win, you see that they were very clear about implementing what they thought is their core political agenda, their core ideological agenda. Article 370 first, and then Ram Mandir, and then CAA. And they did it against much opposition from all quarters, the entire opposition, some from within the ruling government as well, a kind of tag team on this issue, but they showed their political commitment. But one interesting thing is that right immediately after the Article 370 was passed, BJP almost, they won an election in Maharashtra in alliance, but not so convincingly, and then they were kind of thieved of the results. And second, they won a very narrow victory in Haryana, which goes to show that these were ideologically important issues for the BJP, but they were not necessarily translating into votes once they were implemented.
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic opening remark, Rangesh. A couple of things, surprise me about how people are surprised. They're surprised that first the job of a political party is to win elections, right? And then somehow they're surprised that their libertarian views of whether open capital markets or whatever are not implemented by a supposedly right-wing government, in a country of over 20% people below poverty line, right? So some of these things, I think, has to do with people having to temper their own expectations of, how Prime Minister Modi or BJP will run the country. Ashish, one of the things that I want to come to you on a related point is that all of this effective focus on elections has led to a sort of a decimation of the opposition at the center, right? So if you look at the Indian National Congress, they have, I think, about 4 chief ministers right now, and although they've tried to forge an alliance with state parties across India, they seem even more scattered now than before. How do you see a political opposition to the BJP evolving at the center?
Yeah, the challenge carries that when the opposition parties galvanize against BJP together, then there's counter consolidation also in the favor of BJP, and that is why the BJP won the Lok Sabha election the way it won last time, right? So in a one-to-one fight, or if there's a bottom-up division of votes between 2-3 players in each large state, it is quite possible that BJP may lose a bit more. But then the challenge is, can that loose coalition of opposition actually run a central government, right? So I think that the optimal balance is not being struck by the opposition in terms of what works top down and what works bottom up. Uh, if you really look at the elections, it seems that BJP has got about 25-26% votes sealed, and then which is by itself, and then potentially a 7-8% swing vote which it gets, and maybe Congress is stuck at about 13-14%, 15% maybe, and potentially a small upside to that depending on the elections, specific election. So the gap is pretty wide in that sense right now, and what is happening at the center is that the approach which Congress has taken, and this started around the Gujarat election, which was that Congress has been outsourcing a lot of its campaign or a lot of its thought process to third parties, be it NGOs or be it local satraps who will have their own clout in their own specific areas, could be activists, could be student protesters or student leaders. So there's not much central. I mean, what happens is like someone will rise in a state and say, okay, I oppose Modi ji, and then basically Congress will lend support. So the challenge is that approach is not working very well in political terms. It can lead to protests on the streets, or even big opposition on, say, social media narrative and stuff like that. And of course, media, there are enough commentators who will write what Congress wants them to write, or what they align with Congress worldview any which way. But it's not adding up into political support, mainly because there's no centralized theme to it. And Congress has tried a fair bit in terms of repositioning Rahul Gandhi. I think he will soon take over as a president all over again. But unless they find a top-down, issue-driven approach to take on the government, rather than mocking people, mocking some BJP supporters, or mocking the silent voters on social media, etc., which is very routine now. I don't think there'll be any effective resurrection at the central level. States are a different issue because it's a much a different battle, and it's more bottom up in that sense. So BJP will have a more tougher time in the states, but may have a slightly freer run at the center.
Right. So aside from the mathematics, right, of government formation and stuff like that, is there an ideological vacuum that, let's say, Congress or AAP or some other national party can fill in? Rohit or Rangesh, feel free to come in and answer this.
I can take this carry. So I think broadly what's happening is there are 2-3 movements, right, that are happening simultaneously. In the sense that there is a greater, the biggest movement obviously is, at least from the election results, is a lot more people are voting on some sort of ideological grounds for the BJP. I mean, in the sense that there is a lot of Hindu consolidation, right? And obviously, since Hindus are so many in number in this country, like almost 80% of the population, that is obviously a big benefit to the BJP. And what's happening is, if you look at electoral cycles, this is increasingly moving into different parts of the country, in the sense that even states that previously were not within the BJP's ideological framework is moving there, and even certain parties that also served similar aspirations are understanding that they can't really compete with the BJP in this regard. So that is one real movement. Coming to the opposition, I think the opposition is relying on two movements, right, or three broad themes. The first is, of course, the most basic, which is that of minority consolidation against the BJP, and I think that's something they've gotten really good at over the last few years, that they've been able to effectively get minority votes wherever required. And to the extent that is enough to win elections, they have succeeded. The second, I think, is this counter movement among certain group of Hindus, right? I mean, especially people who are more elite and is sort of slightly more educated, especially in foreign universities, etc., who are sort of moving away from the BJP, even if they previously were more ambivalent about it, and etc. So it's a hardening of that division among certain communities. So that is something that is started. It's not really politically very significant at this point, because in terms of numbers, that's not a lot. But in terms of setting the narrative, etc., this is probably something we should keep an eye out on for the next 5-10 years, because this group has disproportionate influence in things like media, especially considering the judicial system we have in the judiciary, etc. And leaving that aside, as it will probably, as India grows more prosperous, it's possible that even in terms of sheer numbers, this group will gain greater clout, and that is something that you've seen all over the world, right? As in whether it's the US, the UK, or even some of the European countries, that as people get more prosperous, they do tend to move to the liberal left or the progressives in a lot of places. And while we are nowhere close to that level of material, this thing is something we should keep an eye out on. And the third one, I think the opposition has been trying, is to create maximum divisions among this core Hindu vote of the BJP, right? As in whether it's on caste lines or regional lines. So there's a regional agenda that worked pretty well in Tamil Nadu, for instance, in 2019, or for the few years before that, where it was seen as a BJP government oppressing Tamil Nadu to some extent as a North Indian government. The Shiv Sena has tried to justify its change of stance using Marathi pride. Then various groups try to use caste as this thing, and it's obviously at some point, this is the key question of what India is, right? As in, is India a relatively homogeneous civilizational state which has a lot of differences but ultimately belongs to the same civilization, or is it, or the other question of whether India is actually just a geographical expression or a political entity that's just been cobbled together? And some point, I think we are increasingly moving to people who represent different views of this, and that's going to impact our politics.
Yeah. So Rangesh, as Rohit mentioned, right, opposition parties are not really afraid to drive at some of these social fissures, whether it's caste, religion, etc. To that end, I mean, did it surprise you to the extent with which they did it with something like CAA and stuff like that? Risking India's social cohesion and even global alienation as such.
I think CA, as far as the CA protests are concerned, they were more targeted at the Western audience, right? The point that Rohit made about creating fissures within the Hindu spectrum is something that the Congress has done, let's say, starting with the Jat agitation, and then the Maratha agitation, and then the separate Lingayat movements. At local audiences with immediate political effect in the interim, right? But as far as CA is concerned, I think the goal was to create some kind of a disturbance which showcases, to the international audience. If you remember, they strategically escalated the violence in Delhi
around Shaheen Bagh the day Donald Trump landed in Ahmedabad. And I don't know if this was intended for local audience, because if that was the case, then Congress has either forgotten its lessons about political India, right? The image of burqa-laden women and conservative-looking Muslims fighting for very parochial conservative Muslim cause like CAA, in which Indian Muslims are not even affected, is not something that is going to find a lot of takers in the mainstream population, right? So if the intent was to create some kind of an antipathy among citizens against the government, they probably didn't succeed in it, because this was not the right constituency through which they could catalyze that. It was definitely involved or targeted at the international audience, is my surmise.
Gary, there is one point which the opposition doesn't, I think they don't give enough importance, which is to say that an average Indian, irrespective of the voting loyalties, is very nationalistic. We cannot undermine a national interest in the name of local politics, right? And people, and this transcends parties or regional affiliations. People are not going to vote for causes or vote with groups, or be seen along with groups who are seen who are talking things which are anti-national or anti-India in general. I think unless that streak of opposition goes away, BJP will have a very comfortable position. I think the only politician who understands that is potentially Arvind Kejriwal. He used it to good effect in the Delhi election. He actually denied. He actually rebuked some Pakistanis who were trying to support him over BJP during the Delhi election. And I think he understands that issue, but I think the rest of the opposition doesn't. And unless that happens, it will be very difficult to create a central opposition to the BJP rule.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the way the opposition parties have ceded the ground on nationalism to BJP is actually stunning, right? Considering that, I mean, we can go back 3 generations to when India was not independent, right? 3 or 4 generations. It's really surprising, right? Rohit, I want to talk to you about another reform that happened over the last year. That was a hot button topic, which was Article 370. You know, I think Ashish mentioned this earlier on the podcast that it was one of those core principles that led to the formation of Jansangh and BJP. Could you explain the significance of this to the listeners beyond just like a rule of law, right? Even politically and socially, what is the significance of this?
Yeah, so Carrie, I think as we mentioned earlier in the podcast, this was of course always a key ideological agenda for the BJP, right? And it was something that even when it happened, like people really sort of thought it was never going to really happen. And then when it happened, was done in a very it was done in a very clinical way, right? And if you sort of try to look back at it, realize that I think it was something that was planned right from the day the the Jammu Kashmir elections happened in 2014, I think it was, and the BJP and the PDP came together, or at least maybe a couple of years later. But this was something that had been planned over a lot of years, and it was done, and a lot of things had to go right for that to happen, right from the PDP and the BJP breaking up, then ensuring that an alternative government couldn't really take place in Jammu and Kashmir, then the BJP having to win the elections in 2019 with the amount of seats it actually got, and the general overall political composition being very favorable of the Lok Sabha and even the Rajya Sabha. And that, to that extent, I think it was a very well thought out move from the party and the government. And obviously, it was a key ideological thing, right? As Ashish mentioned earlier, it was probably the issue on which this party was formed. How that actually played out, and if you look at it, and again going back to what Ashish said about nationalism, they were not. It was really very difficult for the opposition parties to sort of question it, they had to go along with it, and there were no real protests and all of that which came later with the CAA. Even globally, if you look at it, while there were criticisms from, you could say, extreme left parties and politicians like, say, Jeremy Corbyn, the broader global community also, I think, was largely not involved or interested in it. And that way, it went off pretty well, is from the government's perspective, is what I could think of. The opposition's this thing on helplessness in face of 370, you could see in the elections for Maharashtra, Haryana, etc., where obviously the results didn't go too well for the BJP as to what was expected. But the constant criticism of 370 there was, why are they talking about it in a state election and not really on what should have been done with 370? I think that's a indicator of where the national mood, so as to speak, was actually on 370.
Right. And, I mean, the government has also been pretty tactical about dealing with another sort of a power structure, which is the judiciary, right? There is talk of, institutions losing power and so on. But, judges continue to operate independently, perhaps all too independently, some could say. Rangesh, how do you think Prime Minister Modi has handled the judiciary?
Hi. See, I'll go back to my original point about how the first phase was a consolidation, the first 5 years, right? And once they had consolidated their power base, they never lost any time in terms of either implementing their agenda or showing both agility as well as seriousness in trying to do so. And the way they have dealt with the judiciary, of course, exploiting the opportunities offered by the opposition, I'll come to that in a bit, in this regard, is a case in point. The judiciary in India has been on in its own, has been fairly largely independent and has been overbearing on the executive, not just during Modi's first phase of government, but it already started from 2011 when the Manmohan Singh government became very weak. And that has continued, say, until I would say early 2019. But something, changed after that. You saw that, first with Deepak Mishra, you saw the ruptures within the judiciary, and then at that point in time, he was accused of, by the other party of favoring the government. And then what had happened was that there's this issue which happened with the former Chief Justice and current Rajya Sabha MP, Justice Gogoi, and the government and the BJP did use that to a large extent in making some kind of a peace with the judiciary, which enabled the judiciary to see things in a fair manner and in expediting long drawn issues, including the Ram Janmabhoomi issue. Right? To me, that was not the icing in the cake. The icing in the cake and the real political intervention happened immediately after this, when Justice Ranjan Gogoi was promoted, was made a member of the Rajya Sabha. And I think that has, in a sense, triggered expectations, or could have triggered expectations in a lot of sitting judges. I don't know if it has, but the government clearly has indicated has signaled its willingness to accommodate judges. Now, time will tell us how this plays out in terms of incentivizing other judges to be less antithetical and antagonistic to the government. But it clearly signals a very bold step that the government has taken in this regard. I'll just end this bit, this phase of my answer with one bit of observation, which is that in the CAA protests, I mean the run-up to it, right? We did see that the judiciary wasn't as proactive and zealous and as independent-minded to the point of being reckless as it used to be in the past. So that does signal to some extent that the judiciary has also been kind of an agreement has been reached out with them in this term, and that's to me that's one of the biggest defining points of the past 1 year.
So, Karim, I will just like to add one point here, and to echoing what Rangesh is saying. See, Congress had done remarkably well over the years because of its total control over how the judicial system used to work, right? And they had like fabulous lawyers, many of whom are their MPs even now. And they really understand the nitty gritty of how this whole system works, and they're able to work their way through the nuances very effectively. The way BJP dismantled Article 370, I think that essentially used the provisions contained in the constitution itself, and how that was used to basically create a backdoor in Feb 2019, and then which then led to the August amendment, or rather the repeal of the article. I think that was really a masterstroke, and I think that also shows that uh, there can be an alternative view to run these things, or to take control of the judicial. If not the ecosystem, at least the way things happen in this world. But it's a one-off still. Of course, that was the first example. But I think it's a good sign that there's some balancing happening on the judicial side as well, where the Congress monopoly is being challenged.
Carrie, I would just like to add one point here, to just one brief point to what Ashish was talking about, which is that apart from signaling very strong government, quote unquote, in once it took reins in May, especially on 370, one thing which the BJP has clearly worked on is in getting, or at least in creating a sound legal advisory system for itself, at times leaning upon people who might not always meet eye to eye with them. I very clearly am talking about the involvement of Mr. Harish Salve, who is reputed to have been involved with the government on 370 and who doesn't really always look eye to eye with the BJP on many other issues. And this, I think, is also another plus, wherein they are clearly working on creating a legal framework of experts, an ecosystem of legal experts that kind of challenges the Congresses and who understand the system, who knows how the system can be, put to use.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to add on this is I think the tale of how the judiciary's relationship with the government and parliament has evolved over the last, over independent India is something that we can even do a separate podcast on, right? Because it has several elements to it. But what one needs to understand is in a constitutional democracy like India, where ultimate this thing of interpreting the law always lies with the judiciary. The judiciary inherently becomes a political organ. Now everyone likes to sort of maintain this whole veneer that the judiciary is neutral or objective, and the biggest criticism to this, of course, comes from the US, from the left, in what's called the critical legal studies movement. But it applies globally, I think. And what we have to understand is this judiciary sort of responds to impulses from outside, and not just the government, right? Like it also looks at what is public perception. So when the public perception is that the government is generally, incompetent, blundering, or not interested in a lot of things, like, or there's a power vacuum in government, the judiciary starts moving in. But at the same time, it restricts itself when it seems to be sort of not clear what when the government seems to have a clear idea or the public seem to have a clear idea on a matter. And I think what we could see over the 6 years of the Modi government is, I think initially there was a feeling that this was a freak result and things will go back to normal. And a lot of people, obviously, especially from the progressive left, who dominate a lot of the upper things of the Congress and provide a lot of its intellectual support, thought that the judiciary could act as a bulwark against this government, which really was not, in their eyes, legitimate even. And that moved for a long time, but it sort of started slipping away around the time of, say, 2018, I would say. And obviously, after the re-election, the judiciary has just not been as interested in taking on some of these things as it was previously. Obviously, there's personal change involved, but that's not the only thing. And just to give one last example, even in this whole lockdown and movement of migrants, initially when it looked like, there was massive public support for the way government was going about things, the judiciary stayed out of it, even though some of the usual government critics like Prashant Bhushan wanted to give get judgments on various things. But moment the judiciary realized that there was some sort of larger concerns in wider society about what's actually happening with migrant workers, they were happy to intervene. And recently, I think they passed a couple of orders also. So that just shows how the judiciary is not some unchanging body. It reflects wider society in some way, or at least part of wider society that it listens to.
Right. And another key power structure that has emerged in this whole equation is the media, right? Ashish, we've noticed that they've gone beyond simply reporting to actually engaging in hardcore activism. Now, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I mean, we can probably discuss it on another episode altogether. But how do you think Prime Minister Modi and the government at the center has handled the media as such?
The philosophy which appears, which the PM is using, is to ignore the media rather than handling it, right? So PM has always emphasized on using social media, using direct channels of communication with the people and with the voters. He has created the avenues. I mean, of course, as a political leader, he had done that using social media. But even in the government, he has created Man Ki Baat, and then he keeps addressing the nation once in a while. He's using the NM app quite effectively. So the prevalent view, and this is where I guess it differs from what the supporters think, but the government wants to essentially co-opt media where it can, uh, keep it functional in terms of relationship where they can give stories which could be useful, or just plain ignore them. I don't think this government reacts as much to media narrative as the past Indian governments have done. The value of big names writing columns and being able to drive narrative, which was a very common theme, let's say, before the Modi government was sworn in 2014. I think that has completely gone away. I don't think a single media article or a single uh, uh, comment by a big name today impacts the way government thinks. It's good in a way that uh, the monopoly of some voices has gone down, but I hope the government has got an alternative feedback mechanism where it can aggregate, and I think they do via the social media, etc. But there has to be some feedback mechanism in place where the general comments or the general voice is being heard at the top echelons. But I think the overall relevance, and I mean this is one of the characteristics of PM Modi, is that he probably looks to make things redundant rather than trying to solve past issues. Right? I think that's how he has been working with the media so far.
Yeah, and I mean, people tend to paint him as this vengeful person, who will go after you if you write an unkind story of sorts. But really, I mean, much to the disappointment of his core voter base as such, he hasn't done anything of that sort, and not for a statesmanly reason or whatever, but just that it doesn't make any tactical or strategic sense. Right? Between Trump and Modi. I mean, people compare them for some reason, right? But that's been a significant difference between them. Rohit, also, I wanted to talk to you about Ram Janmabhoomi, right? So the verdict pretty much ended like a 3-decade-old dispute. Uh, your thoughts on that particular episode?
Yeah. So, Carrie, I think Ram Janmabhoomi, obviously, there's a whole legal discussion around it, because at the end of the day, it was a judgment that happened and not a political decision. And that, I think, we can even take up on another episode, because there's a lot of legal and historical arguments to go through. But I think from the point of view of this episode, what's relevant is that at the end of the day, there was a political angle to this, right? in the sense that if you look at the entire hearings that went on during the time of Justice Deepak Mishra as Chief Justice, there was clearly a sort of desperation by people opposed to a Ram Mandir to just keep pushing the hearings. And a lot of this was definitely tied to the expectation that, when 2019 elections came, the BJP may or may not come back to power, or even if it does, it will come back with a lesser mandate. And that would be sort of reflected in whatever judgment that comes out of it. Now, obviously, that's not how things panned out, unfortunately, for these people. But I think and tying this back to our previous question, right, of the judiciary, when you look at something like Ram Janmabhoomi, it's a judicial dispute, but at the end of the day, it's a very political dispute, right? Like, yes, it's a land dispute, but it's political. And there, that verdict, whether it would have come out in the way it did, if it was a different government, or whether it would have come out at all, is something that one really needs to contemplate, because it's not so straightforward that, suddenly after so many years, in Allahabad High Court judgment, I think, came in 2010, suddenly the Supreme Court decided to close this issue, close it in this particular manner with not even a single dissenting judgment. Obviously, Justice Gogoi was very insistent that this comes out before he retired. But I think there definitely was some connection to the overall political. And I'm not saying that there was some political this thing involved, right? It's just that just the results of 2019, I think, probably showed the judiciary also where, the common Indian, or at least Hindu, or whatever, stood on this topic. And whether that's how certain disputes of this kind need to be adjudicated, obviously that's an open issue. But the other point, of course, is such a thing actually, was the Ram Janmabhoomi issue ever supposed to be of the nature that could have been decided by a court?
Right. And Rangesh, the use of political capital for these issues, right? That's really something to, think about. That Prime Minister Modi is willing to take these bold and daring decisions because he somehow perceives the will of the people, right? And he's able to translate that into reforms or policy as required.
Absolutely. Though in the specific case of Ram Janmabhoomi and Article 370, I believe that it came from a much more from a position of ideological commitments made on this front in the past. Because as I said earlier, a while back, it clearly didn't translate into the kind of political votes that one would have expected. Obviously, these are politically important issues, core issues. But I think more than political capital, it was ideological. What do you call that? Commitment to it, which drove them to those decisions. But there is one issue on which there was a clear commitment or clear demonstration by the Prime Minister that he will take the tough call on things which matter to the people, and which is CAA, right? We must understand one thing about the CAA issue, that it might be a non-issue for most Indians, Hindus or Muslims, but it is definitely an issue in Bengal, where CAA was principally brought in to accommodate Bengali Hindus, close to a crore of whom from East Bengal, close to a crore of whom live in West Bengal. And CAA was brought in to safeguard their interests primarily, of those who were already in our soil and are here either as tenuous citizens on fake IDs and passport, or are here as refugees, right? And this is a constituency which the BJP is targeting, where there is political capital also involved, because it is a commitment that they have made, both Mr. Modi and Mr. Amit Shah had made in the run-up to the elections in 2019. And that is one clear example of the phenomenon that you spoke about, Carrie, which is betting his money where the political capital is.
Right. Ashish, one of the strong points of this government has been, its deft handling of foreign policy as such. while PM Modi himself has been sort of a natural at this, his ministers have been strong as well, right? Starting with Sushma Swaraj, known for her empathy and her care, to now Dr. Jaishankar, with his incisive sort of a realpolitik, modern diplomacy as such. Dr. Jaishankar, who we also dubbed the silver fox in a previous episode. Your thoughts on this?
The foreign policy has certainly been an area where there's been a marked divergence from the previous approaches. I remember in one of the interviews, I think it was in London, where PM Modi had said that India will talk with all the other governments looking in their eyes, right? So we will not try to outsmart anyone. We will not try to be pressurized we will not get pressurized by anyone, but we will essentially talk to them as equals. I think that's been implemented for most part. The fact that much more professional or much more technocrat view has been brought into the ministry probably also signals that change. Um, the foreign the whole foreign relations has become less political, much less internally focused, and it has taken a shape where areas like trade or uh, trade, commerce, and of course national security, they take precedence in terms of driving our foreign policy interests. So this is certainly a marked departure. I mean, of course, aided in great measure by late Sushma Swaraj and now by S. Jaishankar. But uh, this is an interesting area because as the world realigns in the post-COVID world, there's a talk of creating a D10 grouping, which is a G7 plus 3 countries, including India, and a grouping of democracies to take on Chinese hegemony and so on. So I think this will be an area to watch out for. Of course, with Chinese aggression on the Indian borders, it becomes even more relevant. But one of the legacies of the Modi government 1 and 2 will be the marked departure of India's foreign policy, much better aligned with India's national interests and commercial interests.
I think, Carrie, just to give a perspective on foreign policy, I think what we are seeing is a more clear articulation of what exactly India stands for, right? And in terms of maintaining its sovereignty, in terms of deciding that there are certain national interests that, in the opinion of the government at least, cannot be questioned, and then articulating it irrespective of what the consequences are. And here, I mean, Dr. Jayashankar's famous statement in a think tank event or something, where he said, or where in reference to question on now your friends are now a lot of our friends are criticizing us, and he said, now, or maybe it's just that now we know who our true friends are, and that's a very open point of view on this, right? That India is being very clear. For instance, there's this long-term, and just to give one example, this long-term fascination with Iran, in the sense that, well, of course, Iran does give an outlet for Afghanistan, which is otherwise blocked through Pakistan, and the port issue is there. But otherwise, there was also for a long time this thing that India had to maintain a relationship with Iran just to show that it's not bowing down to the US. And Dr. Jayashankar's response, and this was all in a question of some Iranian comment, was very open and clear in that, we have our interests and we are not going to get sort of, browbeaten by somebody else who claims to have a moral high ground. The other thing I think is on foreign policies, the government has clearly used a very favorable window internationally to push a lot of these things through, because, I mean, of course, Namaste Trump was there, but even otherwise, President Donald Trump has really not been interested in a lot of these issues which have become hot ticket issues, right? Like Article 370 or CAA, etc. That may not necessarily be the case with somebody else as president, irrespective of whether they were a Democrat or a Republican. And I think in that sense, the government has really played its cards well in pushing a lot of these key ideological things through when Donald Trump is president. I mean, he may still continue to be the president, but they've clearly used that window very well.
Just to add to what Rohit said about foreign policy, uh, I think one of the defining features of foreign policy, Indian foreign policy under Prime Minister Modi, is that it has become very Indian self-interest oriented, as against, say, India trying to prove a point that nobody understood, right? And in the pursuit of this self-interest, we have also not shied away from taking positions, domestic positions, even among our potential allies and for international stakeholders. For instance, Prime Minister Modi's explicit endorsement or implicit endorsement of President Trump through Namaste Trump, and us clearly backing Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and leveraging our relationship with him for a host of other things, shows that we no longer are constrained by self-restricted and imposed restrictions on not kind of taking positions within camps in other countries, and doggedly pursuing our self-interest over notions of undefined and undefinable uh, notions of international order and diplomacy.
Right. So moving on, from foreign affairs and diplomacy, one can't disregard the disappointment people have with the economy, right? For whatever reasons, uh, we're reeling under a slowdown right now, and you can argue how much of this is due to fundamental reforms and shaking up of the machinery that the government has undertaken, whether it's through GST or addressing the NPA issue and so on. How much of this is through systemic risks that are unraveling now due to COVID? But Ashish, where do you think the disconnect is between expectations and reality, and what can the government do to kind of redeem itself?
the the disconnect I feel on the economy is because the government has not been as imaginative as it has been on the political, social front, or on the foreign policy front, right? So the new ideas which the government has tried, that has not been reflected in the uh, in the economic decision making. I mean, of course, some of the points which you mentioned on the structural issues around GST, RERA, IBC, I think they are very useful and will continue to be useful for a long time. Even in this term, the cutting the corporate tax rate for incentivizing new manufacturing firms, etc., was a great move. But the agility which has been there on other fronts has been missing on the economy side. Also, I think it has been much more dogmatic. I mean, one view, I mean, one characteristic of the Modi government in general of 6 years is the government is not very dogmatic. It has been very pragmatic in terms of its decision making. Unfortunately, on the economy side, the dogma has ruled a lot. So, for example, like the fiscal deficit will not bust some figure, whatever that figure is, 3.3% and 3.5 now, 3.8%. Or the rich have to pay more taxes, and by more I mean not 35%, but like 43% is the marginal rate now, right? Which is one of the highest in any country, barring the ones which have got mandatory social security. So I think some of these dogmatic approaches on the taxation against capital gains tax. I mean, India has got a securities transaction tax, a short-term capital gains tax, and a long-term capital gains tax, right? So I think some of these things uh, actually do not add much to the government coffers. So, for example, by increasing the marginal tax rate on very rich people, India probably gets about 15,000 crores a year. By imposing capital gains tax, India has got nothing because there have been no capital gains since the tax has been introduced. So, but it creates a lot of skepticism for either the investors or also the supporters of the government in many cases. I think that in other areas, government has also undone things very rapidly when faced with feedback. But somehow on the financial side, that doesn't seem to be happening. I think to me is the biggest issue. The way the government has communicated these things, and has not reacted as not been as fleet-footed as it has been in other areas. I think that's the biggest challenge.
All right, it's been a fascinating deep dive on Modi 2.0, and thank you everyone who tuned in to listen to this episode. Hope this was as insightful as we had hoped it would be. Bharatvaarta is available on Anchor.fm, Apple and Google Podcasts, Spotify, Pocket Casts, and a bunch of other popular platforms. If you like this episode, we're going to be producing way more than this. Please subscribe and share this episode. Until next time, please stay safe and take care of yourselves. Jai Hind.